For 9 years, the girl touched her ear. Every doctor said the same thing. Nothing we can do. Her father spent $30 million, flew across the country, begged specialists to look again. They all shrugged. Then a maid noticed something no one else did, and what she found inside that child's ear will leave you speechless. Timothy Boynton was a billionaire. Real estate empires, biotech labs, private estates in Connecticut and Florida. More money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. But his daughter Michelle was born deaf. 9 years old, never heard a sound. Timothy tried everything. Boston Children's Hospital, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, specialists who charge thousands per hour. They ran tests, scans, procedures. All of them said the same thing. Irreversible. Accept it. But Timothy couldn't accept it because Michelle was all he had left. His wife died giving birth to that girl. Laurel Boynton, the only woman he ever loved, bled out on a table at Stamford Hospital while doctors scrambled to save the baby. So Timothy kept searching, kept spending, kept begging God for an answer. What he didn't know, the answer wasn't coming from a hospital. It was coming from the woman he just hired to clean his floors. Nancy was a maid, 34, no degree, no credentials, just a woman from Savannah, Georgia, trying to survive. But she noticed something about Michelle that every specialist had missed. Something in her ear, something dark. And one evening, while Timothy was away, she made a decision that would either save that girl's life or destroy her own. What happened next? I need you to see it for yourself. Before we continue, pause for a second. This story exists because people stayed silent when they shouldn't have. If you believe children shouldn't suffer because adults look the other way, subscribe now. And if you won't, tell us in the comments why you're okay watching a story like this and doing nothing. The Boynton estate stretched across 40 acres of Greenwich, Connecticut land. From the outside, it looked like a dream. Colonial columns, windows that sparkled in the sunlight, gardens trimmed to perfection. But inside, silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that feels like rest. This silence was heavy, thick, like something had died, and no one had buried it yet. Servants moved through the hallways without speaking. Their footsteps were soft, careful. They'd learned quickly. Mr. Boynton liked things quiet. No music played in that house, no television noise, no laughter bouncing off the walls, just silence. And somewhere in that silence, a father was drowning. Timothy Boynton sat in his study most evenings, staring at the family portrait above the fireplace. There she was, Laurel, his wife, her smile frozen in oil paint, her eyes still bright, still alive. Next to her, a younger version of himself, looking hopeful, looking whole, and between them, Michelle, 3 years old in the portrait. Before Timothy understood that his daughter would never hear her mother's name. Laurel died the day Michelle was born. Complications, the doctors called it. Too much bleeding, too little time. Timothy held her hand while the light left her eyes. She'd been trying to say something. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Just like their daughter. Timothy never forgave himself. If he'd chosen a different hospital, if he'd demanded better care, if he'd been paying closer attention, maybe she'd still be here. Maybe Michelle would be different. The guilt sat on his chest like a stone he couldn't lift. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He spent money, millions of dollars, the best specialists on earth, flights across the country, hotels that cost more per night than most people earned in a month. Every doctor said the same thing. Your daughter's deafness is congenital. There's nothing we can do. You need to accept this. Accept it. How could he accept that his girl would live in silence forever? How could he accept that Michelle would never hear her father say, "I'm sorry your mother isn't here"? So Timothy kept searching, kept writing checks, kept hoping that somewhere out there, someone had the answer. He didn't realize the answer wasn't coming from a specialist. It was coming from someone he'd never think to look at twice. Someone who was about to walk through his front door with nothing but faith in her heart and bills she couldn't pay. Her name was Nancy, and she was about to change everything. Nancy Trammell arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that makes everything feel heavier than it should. She stood at the gate of the Boynton estate, clutching her bag with both hands, trying to steady her breathing. This was it, her last chance. Back in Savannah, her younger brother was living in a group home. The bills were piling up on Nancy's kitchen table like a tower she couldn't stop from growing, 2 months behind. That's what the letter said. If she didn't pay, they'd move him to a state facility, the kind of place where people were forgotten, where no one held your hand, where you became a number instead of a name. Nancy couldn't let that happen. Her brother had been born with hearing problems, ear infections left untreated when their parents couldn't afford doctors. Nancy had raised him herself after their mother got sick, fed him when there was nothing in the fridge, prayed over him when life felt impossible. That boy deserved better than a cold room and strangers who didn't care. So Nancy took this job, maid at a billionaire's mansion. She didn't care about the fancy address, didn't care about the wealthy family. She just needed the paycheck. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, met her at the door. Stern face, sharp eyes, the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgave nothing. "You're Nancy." "Yes, ma'am." "You'll clean. You'll stay quiet. You'll keep to yourself. Mr. Boynton doesn't like disruptions, especially around his daughter." Nancy nodded. "I understand. Do you?" Because the last girl didn't. She tried to get too friendly with the child, thought she could help. She was gone within a week. Nancy swallowed. "I'm just here to work, ma'am." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Follow me." As they walked through the mansion, Nancy kept her eyes down, but she couldn't help noticing things. The silence so thick, it felt alive. The way the other servants moved without speaking, without smiling, the heaviness that hung in the air like fog that wouldn't lift. And then she saw her, a small girl sitting on the marble staircase arranging puzzle pieces in a perfect line. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge anyone. Her shoulders were hunched, her movements careful, precise, but what caught Nancy's attention was something else. The way she kept touching her right ear, just briefly, almost like a habit, and the tiny wince that crossed her face each time she did. Nancy's chest tightened. She'd seen that look before, on her brother's face, years ago, before they finally got him help. She didn't say anything, just kept walking. But her heart whispered something she couldn't ignore. Pay attention. Days passed. Nancy cleaned floors, wiped windows, folded linens. She kept her head down like Mrs. Patterson told her, but she couldn't stop watching Michelle. Every morning, same routine. The girl would sit alone in the sunroom, surrounded by notebooks and colored pencils. Her world was small, contained, safe. No one bothered her there. The other servants avoided her, not out of cruelty, out of fear, like her silence was something they might catch. Some whispered that the girl was cursed, that losing her mother at birth had taken her hearing with her. Superstition, that's what it was. But Nancy saw something different. She saw a child who was desperately lonely, a girl who sat by windows and pressed her small hand against the glass, watching the world move without her. She saw the way she'd look at her father sometimes when Timothy walked past without stopping, and how her little shoulders would sink just a bit lower. She saw how she touched her ear over and over, wincing each time, and no one noticed. Or maybe they'd stopped noticing long ago. One afternoon, Nancy was dusting the hallway near the sunroom when she saw Michelle struggling with a jigsaw puzzle piece. Her small fingers couldn't get the piece to fit. Frustration creased her face. She shouldn't interfere. Mrs. Patterson's warning echoed in her mind. But before she could stop herself, Nancy knelt down and gently took the piece. She fitted it into place with a soft click. Michelle looked up at her. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then something happened. The tiniest smile, just a flicker at the corner of her mouth. Nancy's heart cracked wide open. She smiled back, gave her a small wave. Michelle waved in return. That night, Nancy lay in her bed thinking about that wave. Such a small thing, but it meant everything. And she thought about that ear, about the way Michelle kept touching it, about the pain in those wide, observant eyes. Nancy had seen pain like that before. She knew what it looked like when something was trapped, something that didn't belong. But how could that be possible? This was Michelle Boynton, daughter of one of the richest men in America, a girl who'd been examined by the best doctors in the world. If something was wrong, wouldn't they have found it? Nancy stared at the ceiling, questions spinning through her mind. What she didn't know yet, what no one in that house knew, was that Michelle Boynton's story didn't begin with Nancy's arrival. It began 9 years earlier, in a hospital room where a mother took her last breath and a father made a promise he couldn't keep. It began with money that couldn't buy miracles, and doctors who saw what they wanted to see. It began with a little girl who never heard laughter, and a silence that should never have existed. This is that story. Michelle's mornings always started the same way. 7 o'clock, curtains drawn back by whoever was assigned to her room that week, breakfast on a tray, oatmeal, orange juice, toast cut into triangles the way her father insisted, even though Michelle never asked for it. Then the tutors arrived. Miss Caldwell came on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. She taught reading and writing, sitting across from Michelle at the small desk by the window. Michelle was brilliant at reading. She devoured books faster than Miss Caldwell could assign them, but conversation was impossible. So they wrote notes back and forth on lined paper, Michelle's handwriting neat and careful, Miss Caldwell's replies always too cheerful, too encouraging, like she was trying to make up for something missing. Speech therapy came on Tuesdays and Thursdays with Mr. Brennan, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who made Michelle practice forming words she couldn't hear. He'd place her hand on his throat so she could feel the vibrations, then guide her fingers to her own throat and make her try to mimic the movements. Michelle hated it, not because Mr. Brennan was unkind. He wasn't, but because every session reminded her of what she'd never have, a voice that sounded right, words that connected to the world instead of just shapes her mouth, made in silence. After lessons, Michelle was left alone. She'd sit in the sunroom with her puzzles or wander to the tall windows that overlooked the front lawn. Sometimes she'd see children outside the estate gates, kids riding bikes, laughing, shouting to each other across the street. Michelle would press her palm flat against the cold glass and watch them. Most people would have walked past that window. Most people would have said, "Not my problem." If you don't want to be most people, subscribe now. And if you think you would have ignored her too, be honest, say it in the comments. She wondered what laughter sounded like, what her own voice would sound like if it worked the way theirs did. She wondered if she'd ever have friends who understood her without needing a notepad. Most days, the wondering hurt too much, so she'd turn away and go back to her puzzles. In the evenings, Timothy would come home. Michelle always heard him, not with her ears but with her body, the vibration of the front door closing, the faint tremor of his footsteps through the floor. She'd run to him with a note already written. "Hi, Daddy. How was your day?" Timothy would read it, smile, kiss the top of her head, and then disappear into his study. He never wrote back. Michelle told herself he was busy, that running companies and managing investments took all his energy. But deep down, she knew the truth. Her father couldn't look at her without seeing her mother. Laurel Boynton had died in a white room at Stamford Hospital on a Tuesday morning in March. Michelle had been told the story enough times by enough people that it felt like a memory even though she'd never known her mother's face outside of photographs. Laurel had been laughing that morning, excited, ready to meet her baby. Then something went wrong. The bleeding started and wouldn't stop. Doctors shouted. Nurses ran. Timothy held Laurel's hand and begged her to stay. But she didn't. And when Michelle was born 11 minutes later, silent and struggling to breathe, the first thing Timothy felt wasn't joy. It was rage. Not at Michelle. At God. At the universe. At himself. Because his wife was gone and his daughter would never hear him say he was sorry. Nancy had been working at the estate for 2 weeks when Mrs. Patterson reassigned her duties. "You'll help Michelle in the mornings now. Get her dressed, brush her hair, make sure she's ready for her tutors." Nancy nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The first morning, Nancy knocked softly on Michelle's door even though she knew the girl couldn't hear it. She stepped inside and found Michelle already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed in pajamas, staring out the window. "Good morning," Nancy said gently, moving into Michelle's line of sight so the girl could see her. Michelle looked up and gave a small smile. Nancy helped her pick out clothes, a soft blue sweater and jeans, and then sat Michelle down at the vanity to brush her hair. That's when Nancy noticed. Every time the brush came near Michelle's right ear, the girl flinched. Just slightly. Just enough. Nancy paused, studying Michelle's reflection in the mirror. "Does it hurt, sweetheart?" Michelle nodded. Nancy set the brush down and gently turned Michelle's head to the side. She tucked the girl's hair behind her ear and leaned closer. At first, she didn't see anything unusual. Just a child's ear, small and delicate. But then Michelle scratched at it, her small fingers digging at the opening, and Nancy's stomach dropped. There was something inside. Something dark. Something that didn't belong. Nancy's breath caught in her throat. She pulled back slowly, her hands trembling, her mind racing. "What is that?" Michelle looked at her with wide, trusting eyes, completely unaware of what Nancy had just seen. And Nancy knew, right then, that everything was about to change. Nancy couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen. For 3 days, she watched Michelle carefully. Not obviously, not in a way that would draw attention from Mrs. Patterson or the other staff, but she watched. And what she saw terrified her. Michelle scratched at her right ear constantly, sometimes in the middle of lessons with Miss Caldwell, sometimes while sitting alone in the sunroom, sometimes at dinner, her small fingers pressing against the opening like she was trying to dig something out. And every time she did, her face would twist, just for a second, a wince so quick most people would miss it. But Nancy didn't miss it. She'd seen that exact expression on her brother's face years ago, back when the infections had gotten so bad he couldn't sleep through the night. Pain that never stopped. Pain that lived inside you and made everything else disappear. Michelle was suffering, and no one noticed. Or worse, Nancy thought, maybe they'd stopped caring. On Thursday evening, Nancy made a decision. Timothy had flown to Boston for meetings. Mrs. Patterson had gone into town for groceries. The other staff were busy in the kitchen or the West Wing. The house was as quiet as it ever got. Nancy stood outside Timothy's study, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong. If she got caught, she'd be fired. Worse than fired. She could be arrested for going through a billionaire's private files. But Michelle's face kept flashing in her mind. That wince, that pain. Nancy turned the handle and slipped inside. The study was exactly what she expected. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with medical journals and business reports. A massive desk sat in the center of the room, papers stacked neatly on one side, a computer monitor glowing faintly on the other. Nancy moved quickly to the filing cabinets along the back wall. The first drawer was labeled Financial Records. The second, Property Documents. The third, Medical. Nancy pulled it open. Inside were dozens of folders, each one labeled with a hospital name and date. Mayo Clinic 2019, Johns Hopkins 2021, Cedars-Sinai 2022, Stanford Medical 2023. Nancy's hands shook as she flipped through them. Then she found it. Boston Children's Hospital, March 2018. Nancy pulled the folder out and opened it on the desk. Inside were test results, scan images, doctor's notes, pages, and pages of medical terminology she barely understood. But then she saw it. A single line, buried halfway down a radiology report. Foreign object observed in right auditory canal. Recommend immediate extraction. Nancy's breath stopped. She read it again. Foreign object observed. Recommend extraction. The date at the top of the page was the 14th of March 2018, 7 years ago. Nancy flipped frantically through the rest of the file, searching for a follow-up report, a surgery note, anything that showed they'd removed whatever was inside Michelle's ear. But there was nothing. No extraction procedure, no follow-up scan, no mention of it ever again. Nancy's stomach twisted into knots. They knew. The doctors knew there was something in Michelle's ear, and they never took it out. Nancy grabbed another folder. Johns Hopkins 2019. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. Another radiology note, another mention. Unidentified object remains lodged in canal. Extraction recommended, but deferred pending further consultation. Deferred. Nancy wanted to scream. She grabbed folder after folder, scanning through reports from every hospital Timothy had taken Michelle to over the years. Mayo Clinic. Noted but not addressed. Cedars-Sinai. Observed during CT scan. No action taken. Stanford Medical. Patient's family declined intervention. Nancy froze. Declined intervention? Timothy didn't know. He couldn't have known. He'd spent $30 million trying to help his daughter. He wouldn't have refused treatment. Unless he was never told. Nancy's mind raced. What if the doctors hadn't told him? What if they'd buried it in reports they knew he'd never read? What if keeping Michelle deaf was more profitable than curing her? Nancy's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the folders. She carefully put everything back exactly where she'd found it, closed the filing cabinet, and slipped out of the study. Her heart was pounding. Her head was spinning. Michelle wasn't born deaf. She'd been made deaf, and someone had let it happen. This is the moment everyone failed her. Doctors, hospitals, institutions, and silence helped it happen. If you're still watching and you haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself why. If this story makes you uncomfortable enough to hesitate, explain that discomfort in the comments. Nancy stood in the hallway, her back pressed against the wall, trying to catch her breath. She thought about her brother, about the infections that had stolen his hearing because their family couldn't afford proper care, about the guilt she still carried for not getting him help sooner. But Michelle's family could afford anything. They had every resource in the world, and it hadn't mattered. Nancy looked up toward the second floor, where Michelle's bedroom was. That little girl had spent 9 years in silence because someone decided her suffering was worth more than her healing. And Nancy was the only person who knew the truth. $30 million. Nancy had seen the number written at the bottom of a financial summary in Timothy's study. $30 million spent on Michelle's medical care over 9 years. Flights to specialists across the country, consultations that cost more than Nancy made in a year, tests and scans and procedures that led nowhere. $30 million. And his daughter was still deaf. Or so everyone believed. Nancy couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her small room on the 3rd floor, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything she'd read in those medical files. Foreign object observed. Recommend extraction. No action taken. The words looped in her mind like a song she couldn't turn off. At 2 in the morning, Nancy gave up on sleep. She pulled out her phone and started searching. Foreign object in ear canal. Hearing loss caused by blockage. Surgical implant fragments. Page after page of medical articles filled her screen. Nancy read until her eyes burned, until the words started blurring together. But one article made her stop cold. It was from a medical journal, published by a doctor at Columbia University. The title read, Iatrogenic Hearing Loss in Neonatal Patients. Iatrogenic. Nancy had to look up the word. It meant caused by medical treatment. The article described cases where surgical implants used during complicated births had broken apart, leaving fragments lodged in infants' ear canals. In every case, the fragments had blocked sound completely, and in every case, removal had restored hearing within weeks. Nancy's hands trembled as she kept reading. The article went on to explain why these cases were so often missed. The fragments were small, easy to overlook on scans if you weren't looking for them, and removal required a delicate procedure that most general practitioners wouldn't attempt. But specialists would know. Specialists like the ones Timothy had taken Michelle to for 9 years. Nancy set her phone down and pressed her palms against her eyes. They knew. Every single doctor who'd examined Michelle had known there was something in her ear. They'd written it in their reports, buried it in medical jargon, and then done nothing. Because $30 million doesn't come from curing a patient. It comes from treating them forever. Nancy thought about the hospitals she'd seen in those files. Boston Children's, Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic. Institutions with billion-dollar endowments and research programs funded by people like Timothy Boynton, people who kept writing checks as long as there was hope. And hope, Nancy realized, was the most profitable thing in the world. As long as Michelle stayed deaf, Timothy would keep spending, keep donating, keep funding their research programs and building new wings with his name on them. But if Michelle was cured, the money would stop. Nancy felt sick. She thought about telling Timothy, walking into his study and laying everything out in front of him. The reports, the dates, the proof that his daughter had been suffering for profit. But what would happen to her if she did? Nancy wasn't naive. She knew how the world worked. She was a maid, a nobody, a woman with no credentials and no credibility going up against some of the most respected medical institutions in the country. They'd destroy her. Timothy might not even believe her. Why would he? Why would a billionaire trust the word of his housekeeper over doctors from Harvard and Yale? And even if he did believe her, even if he confronted them, what then? Nancy would be fired, blacklisted. She'd never work in Greenwich again, never be able to help her brother, never be able to pay the bills that were already drowning her. But if she stayed quiet, if she just kept her head down and did her job and pretended she'd never seen those files, Michelle would stay broken. That little girl would spend the rest of her life in silence, never knowing that her father's money had been the very thing that kept her trapped. Nancy sat on the edge of her bed, her head in her hands, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she was strong enough to do the right thing. And then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it. Crying. Nancy stood up and opened her door. The hallway was dark, silent except for that soft, muffled sound coming from down the hall. Michelle's room. Nancy's heart clenched. She walked quickly toward the sound, her bare feet silent on the carpet. Michelle's door was cracked open. Nancy pushed it wider and stepped inside. The little girl was sitting on her bed, her knees pulled up to her chest, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with sobs she couldn't hear, and her right hand was pressed hard against her ear, her small fingers digging at it like she was trying to claw something out. Nancy crossed the room and sat down beside her. Michelle looked up, her face wet with tears, her eyes red and desperate. She pointed to her ear. Then she opened her mouth and said something Nancy couldn't understand, a broken, garbled sound that might have been the word hurt. Nancy's heart shattered. She pulled Michelle into her arms and held her tight. And in that moment, Nancy knew. She didn't care what happened to her. She didn't care if she lost her job or her future or everything she'd worked for. She was going to save this child, no matter what it cost. Timothy left for Chicago on a Friday afternoon. Nancy watched from the second-floor window as his black town car pulled up to the front entrance. Two assistants loaded his luggage into the trunk while Timothy stood on the steps, checking his phone, his face tight with the kind of stress that came from managing empires. He didn't go upstairs to say goodbye to Michelle. Nancy wasn't surprised. Timothy rarely did anymore. The car pulled away, disappearing down the long driveway and through the iron gates. Nancy watched until it was gone, a strange feeling settling in her chest. She didn't know why, but something felt different about tonight. By 6 o'clock, the sky had turned dark. Not the normal kind of dark that came with evening, but the heavy, greenish dark that meant a storm was coming. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and bending the trees along the property line. Mrs. Patterson moved through the house, instructing staff to close shutters and bring in the patio furniture. "Storm's supposed to be a bad one," she said to no one in particular. "Everyone stays inside tonight." Nancy nodded and went upstairs to check on Michelle. She found the girl sitting on her bed, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight against her chest. Michelle's face was pale, her eyes red like she'd been crying again. Nancy sat down beside her and gently touched her shoulder. Michelle flinched, then turned and buried her face in Nancy's side. Nancy wrapped her arms around the girl and held her close. She could feel Michelle trembling, her small body tight with pain. Outside, lightning flashed. Thunder cracked so loud the windows shook. Michelle pulled back and pointed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. Then she shook her head violently, her hands waving in front of her like she was trying to say no, no more, please no more. Nancy's heart broke. She'd been wrestling with this decision for days, terrified of what might happen if she tried, terrified of what would happen if she didn't. But looking at Michelle now, seeing the desperation in her eyes, Nancy knew she couldn't wait any longer. She stood up and took Michelle's hand. "Come with me, sweetheart." Michelle followed her down the hall to the bathroom. Nancy closed the door behind them and locked it. She turned on the faucet and let the water run until it was scalding hot. Then she filled a small bowl and set it on the counter. From the medicine cabinet, Nancy pulled out a pair of tweezers. She held them under the hot water, turning them over and over, making sure every surface was clean. Her hands were shaking. She'd done this before, years ago, with her brother. Pulled debris from his ear after an infection. But this was different. This was a billionaire's daughter. This was a fragment that had been lodged in place for 9 years. If Nancy messed this up, she could damage Michelle's ear permanently. She could make things worse. But if she did nothing, Michelle would keep suffering. Nancy dried the tweezers and held them up to the light, checking for any residue. They were as clean as she could make them. She turned to Michelle, who was standing in the doorway, watching with wide, trusting eyes. Nancy knelt down in front of her. "Sweetheart," she said slowly, making sure Michelle could see her lips. "This is going to hurt, but I think I can help you. Do you trust me?" Michelle stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Nancy stood and led Michelle back to her bedroom. She sat the girl down on the bed, propped pillows behind her back, and turned on the lamp on the nightstand so she'd have enough light to see. Michelle clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, her knuckles white. Outside, the storm was getting worse. Rain hammered against the windows, the wind howled through the trees. Lightning lit up the room every few seconds, casting strange shadows across the walls. Nancy pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought she might pass out. She reached out and gently turned Michelle's head to the side, tucking the girl's hair behind her ear. There it was, the dark spot Nancy had seen before, lodged deep in the ear canal, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. Nancy took a deep breath. "Okay, sweetheart. Hold very still for me." Michelle closed her eyes and gripped the rabbit with both hands. She's about to risk her freedom, her job, her future. If someone can risk everything for a child who isn't hers, and you can't even tap subscribe to support stories like this, tell us why in the comments. Nancy lifted the tweezers. Her hand was trembling so badly she had to pause and steady herself. She thought about her brother, about the nights she'd stayed up with him when the pain was unbearable, about the guilt she still carried for not helping him sooner. She thought about Timothy, flying to Chicago, throwing money at problems he didn't understand. She thought about the doctors who'd known the truth and done nothing. And she thought about Michelle, 9 years old, living in silence because no one had cared enough to look. Nancy leaned forward. The tweezers moved toward Michelle's ear. Lightning flashed. Thunder shook the house. And Nancy reached inside. Nancy's hand moved slowly, carefully, the tweezers trembling as they entered Michelle's ear canal. Michelle sat perfectly still, her eyes squeezed shut, her small body rigid with fear and trust all tangled together. Nancy could barely breathe. The tweezers moved deeper, millimeter by millimeter, until she felt them touch something solid. There, Nancy's stomach twisted. Whatever it was lodged tight, wedged deep inside where it had no business being. Nancy adjusted her grip and tried to get the tweezers around it. Michelle whimpered, her fingers digging into the stuffed rabbit. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Nancy whispered. "I'm so sorry." She pulled gently. Nothing moved. Nancy's heart raced. She couldn't pull too hard or she'd hurt Michelle, but she couldn't leave it there either. She repositioned the tweezers, trying to get a better angle. Outside, lightning split the sky. Thunder crashed so loud it felt like the house might collapse. Nancy pulled again. This time, she felt it shift. Michelle's whole body jerked. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. Nancy's hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the tweezers. "Almost there, baby. Almost there." She pulled one more time, slow and steady. Her entire focus narrowed to that tiny space inside Michelle's ear. And then it came free. Michelle screamed. A real scream, loud and raw, and full of pain. But Nancy barely heard it because she was staring at what she'd pulled out. It was small, no bigger than a grain of rice, but it was unmistakable. Black, jagged, unnatural, a piece of surgical polymer, broken and sharp, with dried blood crusted along the edges. Nancy's hands shook as she held it up to the light. This was what had stolen 9 years of Michelle's life. This tiny, terrifying thing. Michelle was still screaming, her hands pressed against her ear, tears pouring down her face. Nancy set the fragment down on the nightstand and reached for Michelle, ready to comfort her. But then something strange happened. Michelle stopped screaming. Her eyes went wide. She pulled her hands away from her ear slowly, like she was afraid to move. And then she turned her head toward the window. Rain was hammering against the glass. Wind howled through the trees. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Michelle stared at the window, her mouth falling open. Nancy watched, her heart pounding. Michelle turned her head the other way, toward the lamp on the nightstand. The bulb hummed faintly, a sound so quiet most people never noticed it. But Michelle noticed. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't tears of pain. She looked at Nancy, and Nancy saw it. The exact moment, everything changed. Michelle's lips moved. "I," she whispered, her voice cracked and uncertain, like she'd never used it before. "I hear." Nancy's breath caught. Michelle's hand went to her throat, feeling the vibrations as she spoke. "I hear you," she said again, louder this time, Nancy's vision blurred with tears. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, sweetheart, you can hear me." Michelle started crying, but she was smiling at the same time, her face a mess of confusion and joy and disbelief. She turned toward the window again, toward the rain. "What is that sound?" she asked, her words slow and careful. Nancy laughed through her tears. "That's rain, baby. That's rain hitting the window." Michelle stood up from the bed, walking toward the window like she was in a trance. She pressed her hand against the glass. "It's loud," she said, wonder filling her voice. Outside, thunder cracked again. Michelle jumped, then laughed. She actually laughed. A real, genuine, unfiltered laugh that filled the room and echoed off the walls. Nancy covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. Michelle spun around, her eyes wide with amazement. "I can hear my feet," she said, stomping on the floor. "I can hear me." She ran across the room and back again, laughing at the sound of her own footsteps. Then she started talking, just saying words, any words, testing her voice like it was a new toy she'd just discovered. "Hello, my name is Michelle. I can hear. I can hear." She turned to Nancy, her face glowing with pure joy. "Say something," she said. "Say my name." Nancy's throat was so tight she could barely speak. "Michelle," she whispered. Michelle burst into tears and ran into Nancy's arms. "Say it again," she begged. "Michelle," Nancy said, holding her tight. "Michelle, Michelle, Michelle." The little girl sobbed into Nancy's shoulder, her whole body shaking. "I never heard my name before," she said, her voice muffled. "I never heard anyone say it." Nancy held her closer, tears pouring down her face. "You're going to hear it every day now, sweetheart. Every single day." Michelle pulled back and looked at Nancy with eyes so full of gratitude it hurt to see. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And then she laughed again. That sound, bright and pure and full of life, filled every corner of the room. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, for the first time in 9 years, Michelle Boynton could hear the world. And the world could finally hear her. Timothy's flight landed at LaGuardia at 10:15 p.m. The drive back to Greenwich took an hour and 13 minutes. He spent most of it on his phone, reading reports from the Chicago meetings, responding to emails that couldn't wait until morning. The biotech acquisition had gone well, better than expected. His lawyers were already drafting contracts. But Timothy felt nothing. He'd closed 100 deals like this, made billions, built empires, and every single time, the victory felt hollow. Because none of it brought Laurel back. None of it fixed Michelle. The car pulled through the estate gates at 11:28 p.m. Timothy gathered his briefcase and stepped out into the cold night air. The storm had passed, leaving everything wet and quiet. He walked up the front steps, already thinking about the bourbon waiting in his study. But then he heard something that made him stop. Laughter. A child's laughter, bright and wild, coming from inside the house. Timothy's heart seized. He pushed open the front door and stood frozen in the entryway. Michelle was running down the main staircase, her hair flying behind her, her face lit up with a smile he'd never seen before. And she was laughing, actually laughing. "Daddy," she shouted. "Daddy, I can hear you." Timothy's briefcase fell from his hand and hit the marble floor with a crash. Michelle jumped at the sound, then laughed again. "I heard that," she said, her voice filled with amazement. "I heard it." Timothy couldn't move, couldn't speak. His mind was trying to process what he was seeing, but failing completely. Michelle ran to him and grabbed his hand. "Say something, Daddy. Say my name. Please." Timothy's mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then he saw her. Nancy, standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale, her hands clasped in front of her like she was waiting for judgment. Timothy's shock turned to something else. Rage. "What did you do?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Nancy opened her mouth to answer, but Michelle spoke first. "She helped me, Daddy. She fixed my ear. I can hear now. Can't you hear me talking?" Timothy's eyes stayed locked on Nancy. "What did you do to my daughter?" Mrs. Patterson appeared from the hallway, her face tight with alarm. "Mr. Boynton, I don't know what happened. I was downstairs and then I heard the child screaming, and when I came up she was talking and—" "Call security," Timothy said. Mrs. Patterson hesitated. "Sir, call them now." Within minutes, 2 security guards entered the house. Timothy pointed at Nancy. "She assaulted my daughter. I want her arrested." "No," Michelle screamed. "Daddy, no, she didn't hurt me. She helped me." But Timothy wasn't listening. His hands were shaking. His vision was blurred with fear and confusion and something that felt like grief turning inside out. "Take her," he said. The guards moved toward Nancy. She didn't resist, didn't argue. Just let them take her arms and lead her toward the door. Michelle ran after them, sobbing. "Daddy, please, please listen to me." There was something in my ear. She took it out. "I can hear now. Don't you understand? I can hear." Timothy grabbed Michelle and pulled her back. "You're not making sense. You're confused. We're taking you to the hospital right now." "I'm not confused," Michelle shouted, her voice cracking. "I'm telling you the truth." But Timothy had already pulled out his phone and dialed. "Get a car to Greenwich Hospital. Now. My daughter needs to be seen immediately." Nancy was led out the front door in handcuffs. She looked back once at Michelle, her eyes full of sorrow and something that looked like pride. Michelle collapsed on the stairs, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Timothy stood in the middle of the entryway, his whole world tilting on its axis. His daughter could talk. His daughter could hear. And he'd just had the woman who'd made it possible arrested. At Greenwich Hospital, Michelle was rushed into an exam room. Timothy stood in the hallway, pacing, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to answer. Dr. Hoffman, the head of pediatric neurology, came out 20 minutes later. "Mr. Boynton, we need to talk." "What's wrong with her?" Dr. Hoffman's face was pale. "Nothing is wrong with her. Her hearing is perfect, completely intact." Timothy stared at him. "That's impossible." Dr. Hoffman pulled out a tablet and showed him the scan images. "Her auditory nerves are fully functional. There's no damage, no abnormalities, but there is evidence of recent trauma to the ear canal." "What kind of trauma?" "Something was removed. Recently, within the last few hours." Timothy's stomach dropped. "Removed?" Dr. Hoffman nodded. "We found trace amounts of blood and tissue damage consistent with extraction. Mr. Boynton, did someone perform a procedure on your daughter tonight?" Timothy couldn't speak. Dr. Hoffman pulled up another image. "We also found medical records in her file. Notes from Boston Children's Hospital, Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic. They all mention a foreign object lodged in her ear canal. It's been there for years." Timothy's legs went weak. "That's not possible. They never told me." Dr. Hoffman's expression darkened. "They should have. Mr. Boynton, your daughter was never congenitally deaf. She had a blockage. It should have been removed years ago." Behind them, another doctor burst through the doors, his face tight with panic. "Dr. Hoffman, we have a problem. The press is outside. Someone leaked the story." Dr. Hoffman's face went white, and somewhere in a holding cell downtown, Nancy sat alone, her hands still trembling, waiting for a world that had already started to crack wide open. Timothy sat in Dr. Hoffman's office at 3 in the morning, staring at medical files spread across the desk. Files he should have read years ago. Files he'd paid other people to read for him. Dr. Hoffman stood by the window, his arms crossed, his face tight with the kind of anger that came from seeing something unforgivable. "This is Boston Children's Hospital, March 2018, Dr. Hoffman said, tapping one of the reports. "Foreign object observed in right auditory canal. Recommend immediate extraction." He picked up another file. "Johns Hopkins, June 2019. Object remains lodged. Extraction recommended." Another file. "Mayo Clinic, September 2020. Unidentified fragment visible on CT scan. Surgical removal advised." Dr. Hoffman threw the file down on the desk. "They all knew, Mr. Boynton. Every single hospital you took your daughter to knew there was something in her ear, and not one of them did anything about it." Timothy's hands were shaking. "Why?" Dr. Hoffman looked at him with something close to pity. "Because you kept paying them. Because as long as Michelle stayed deaf, you kept funding their research programs, kept donating to their departments, kept flying her across the country for consultations that cost $50,000 a visit." Timothy felt like he was drowning. "They let my daughter suffer so I'd keep writing checks?" Dr. Hoffman nodded slowly. "It's not uncommon, Mr. Boynton. Chronic patients are worth more than cured ones, especially when the family has resources like yours. Timothy stood up, his chair scraping hard against the floor. I want every name, every doctor who saw those reports and did nothing. I want them destroyed. Dr. Hoffman handed him a list. These are the attending physicians from each institution. I've already contacted the medical board. By morning, this will be a federal investigation. Timothy stared at the names. Doctors he'd trusted, doctors he'd paid millions, doctors who'd looked him in the eye and told him there was nothing they could do. Liars. All of them. By dawn, the story had broken. News vans lined the street outside Greenwich Hospital. Reporters shouted questions as Timothy's car pulled out of the parking lot. His lawyers had already filed lawsuits against Boston Children's Hospital, Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and Cedars-Sinai. Criminal charges were being discussed. The medical board had launched investigations into 14 doctors across 4 states. Careers were ending before the sun came up. But Timothy felt no satisfaction. He sat in the back of his town car, staring at his phone, scrolling through messages from his attorneys, updates on the lawsuits, statements from hospital administrators scrambling to cover themselves. Apologies that meant nothing. His driver, Warren, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Where to, sir?" Timothy didn't answer right away. He thought about Michelle, about the 9 years she'd spent in silence, about the birthdays where she couldn't hear him say he loved her, about the nights she'd cried herself to sleep because she thought something was wrong with her. And he thought about himself, about the man who'd thrown money at the problem instead of paying attention, who'd trusted institutions because they had prestigious names and impressive buildings, who'd been so blinded by grief and guilt that he'd stopped seeing what was right in front of him. His daughter had been suffering, and a maid from Savannah, Georgia, had been the only person who'd cared enough to notice. Timothy closed his eyes. "Warren," he said quietly, "take me to the police station." Warren's eyes widened in the mirror. "Sir?" Now, the Greenwich Police Department was a small brick building on Mason Street. Timothy walked through the front doors at 6:42 a.m., his lawyers trailing behind him. The desk sergeant looked up, startled. "Mr. Boynton, we weren't expecting." "I'm here to see Nancy Trammell," Timothy said. The sergeant hesitated. "Sir, she's being processed for—" "I know what she's being processed for. I want the charges dropped. Immediately." The sergeant blinked. "Sir, you were the one who—" "I was wrong," Timothy said, his voice breaking. "I was wrong about everything. Within 20 minutes, the paperwork was filed. The charges were dropped. Nancy was released from the holding cell where she'd spent the last 7 hours sitting on a metal bench, staring at the wall. A guard led her down the hallway to a small waiting room. And there was Timothy. He stood when she entered, his face hollow, his eyes red. Nancy stopped in the doorway. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Timothy crossed the room and did something Nancy never expected. He fell to his knees in front of her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Nancy stared down at him, stunned. "You saved my daughter's life," Timothy said, tears streaming down his face. "You did what I couldn't do, what all my money couldn't do. You saw her, you cared about her, and I had you arrested." His whole body shook with sobs. Nancy's throat tightened. "Mr. Boynton," she said quietly, "stand up." Timothy shook his head. "I don't deserve—" "Stand up," Nancy repeated, firmer this time. Timothy slowly got to his feet, his face wrecked with shame. Nancy looked at him for a long moment. "Your daughter can hear now," she said. "That's all that matters." Timothy wiped his eyes. "I need to make this right. Whatever you need, whatever you want, it's yours." Nancy shook her head. "I don't want your money, Mr. Boynton." "Then, what do you want?" Nancy's voice was steady. "I want to see Michelle." Timothy nodded, fresh tears spilling down his face. "She's been asking for you." They drove back to the estate in silence. Nancy sat in the back of Timothy's town car, watching the sun rise over Connecticut. Everything looked different in the morning light, softer, like the world had been washed clean by the storm. Timothy sat across from her, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on something Nancy couldn't see. When they pulled through the gates, Nancy's breath caught. The mansion looked the same as it always had, grand, beautiful, untouchable, but Nancy knew it would never feel the same again. Warren opened the car door, and Nancy stepped out. Timothy followed, moving slowly, like a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. They walked up the front steps together. Mrs. Patterson was waiting in the entryway, her face pale and tight. "She's in her room," she said quietly. "She hasn't stopped asking for you." Nancy nodded and started toward the stairs. Timothy followed. They climbed together, their footsteps echoing through the silent house. When they reached Michelle's door, Nancy paused and looked back at Timothy. He nodded. Nancy knocked softly, then pushed the door open. Michelle was sitting on her bed, still wearing the clothes from the night before. Her eyes were red from crying, her hair tangled and wild. But when she saw Nancy, her whole face lit up. "Nancy," she shouted, and her voice, that new, beautiful voice, filled the room. Michelle jumped off the bed and ran across the room, throwing her arms around Nancy's waist. Nancy held her tight, tears already streaming down her face. "I thought they took you away forever," Michelle said, her voice muffled against Nancy's side. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Michelle pulled back and looked up at her. "My ear doesn't hurt anymore," she said, wonder in her voice. "And I can hear everything. The birds outside, the clock ticking, my own heartbeat." She pressed her hand to her chest. "Did you know your heart makes a sound?" Nancy laughed through her tears. "I did, baby. I did." Michelle turned and saw her father standing in the doorway. Her smile faded. "Daddy?" Timothy stepped into the room slowly, like he was afraid he might break something. "Michelle," he said, and his voice cracked on her name. Michelle stared at him. "Is that what I sound like?" she asked. "When you say my name?" Timothy's face crumpled. He dropped to his knees right there in the middle of the room, tears pouring down his face. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Michelle had never heard her father cry before. She'd seen him sad, seen him distant, seen him disappear into his study for days at a time, but she'd never heard the sound of his grief. It was raw and broken and full of years of pain he'd never let out. Michelle walked slowly toward him. "Daddy," she said softly, "why are you crying?" Timothy looked up at her, his face wrecked. "Because I failed you," he said. "Because I had all the money in the world and I couldn't save you. Because I was so busy trying to fix everything that I didn't see what was right in front of me." He reached out and took her small hand in his. "You were suffering, and I didn't notice. But Nancy did. Nancy saw you. Nancy saved you." Michelle looked back at Nancy, then back at her father. "You didn't fail me, Daddy." Timothy shook his head. "I did. I let them hurt you. I trusted the wrong people. You love me," Michelle said simply. "I know you do. I always knew." Timothy's shoulders shook with sobs. Michelle knelt down in front of him and wrapped her arms around his neck. "And now I can hear you say it," she whispered. Timothy held her tight, crying into her hair. "I love you," he said. "I love you so much." Michelle pulled back and smiled. "Say it again." "I love you, Michelle." "Again." "I love you." Michelle laughed, that bright, beautiful sound that Nancy would never get tired of hearing. "I love you too, Daddy." Nancy stood by the door, watching them, her heart so full it hurt. After a long moment, Michelle stood and took her father's hand. Then she crossed the room and took Nancy's hand. She stood between them, holding both their hands, a bridge between two worlds. "Say my name," she said to Timothy. Timothy wiped his eyes and looked at his daughter. "Michelle," he said, clear and strong. Michelle grinned. "Again, louder." "Michelle," Timothy said, louder this time. Michelle started laughing. She pulled them both toward the door. "Come on," she said. "I want to hear everything. I want to hear the whole house." They walked down the hallway together, Michelle in the middle, pointing at everything. "What's that sound?" "That's the air conditioning," Timothy said. "And that?" The grandfather clock downstairs. "And that?" Nancy laughed. "That's Mrs. Patterson vacuuming." Michelle stopped at the top of the staircase and looked down at the entryway below. The house wasn't silent anymore. She could hear footsteps, voices, the hum of life moving through the rooms. "It sounds different than I imagined," Michelle said softly. "Better or worse?" Nancy asked. Michelle smiled. "Better. So much better." She started down the stairs, her footsteps light and quick. Timothy and Nancy followed. And for the first time since Laurel died, the Boynton mansion was filled with sound. Laughter. Footsteps. Voices calling to each other. Love. Finally loud enough to hear. At the bottom of the stairs, Michelle turned back and looked up at them. Her father, broken and rebuilt. Her hero, quiet and strong. And Michelle Boynton, 9 years old, smiled, because she could finally hear her own name, and it sounded like home. If this story moved you, if you felt anger, relief, or even tears, and you still didn't subscribe, I genuinely want to know why. Say it in the comments, because stories like this only survive when people decide not to look away.